So, hi, colleagues and friends. I've been invited to talk a little bit about teacher presence in online courses by the folks at WOTI. So, I'm really excited to give you some of my reflections and some of my ideas. Obviously, you're able to pick and choose and decide which of these is going to work for you. But I've had some success with teacher presence and the different presences that are involved in working with online courses. So, I'd like to share some of that with you at this point. So here we go. So we're talking about instructional messaging in instructional design, and the idea of instructional messaging is very important, obviously, it's how we present the message in our courses, essentially. So there are three essential presences that we're going to talk about a little bit in order to provide some context for the idea of teacher presence. And here they are. There is the social presence, the cognitive presence, and the teaching presence in courses. And teaching presence is going to be our focus for the most part. But as you can see, all three of these are interrelated. So you can't really talk about teacher presence until you establish in your own mind what that means, as well as how it interacts and interrelates with social presence and cognitive presence. So basically, your teacher presence is who are you and what's your stake in this particular endeavor. Social presence is developing opportunities for your students to interact and also to interact with you. So your teacher presence is important there as well. And cognitive presence has to do with the content that you're working with. But in this way, too, you can communicate ideas about expectations, and sort of what you feel about the course and how the course is developing as you go along from a thinking perspective. And obviously, you always want to encourage your students to think as much as possible. So these three presences are interrelated. Here's a little further definition of these three presences. That instructor presence does mean being there, but it also means knowing who you are and being authentic about your voice and authentic about your understanding and your relationship to the content and the students. Social presence is learner to learner, but it's also learner to instructor. So there's an element of teacher presence in that particular frame as well. And that idea of cognitive presence. And again, you are orchestrating the way in which learners operate and work together, as well as how they work with you in their relationships. So there are all sorts of different strategies about how to establish instructor presence and teacher presence in a course. Here are some of those ideas. Obviously, creating some sort of video-based introduction, developing a syllabus that's interactive, as well as going into online discussions and working with students. Honestly, I haven't had a lot of success working with discussion boards. Usually what I find is that when I intercede in a discussion board or include my 2 cents and my thinking, students tend to drop that thread and move to another thread. I think there's a feeling that the expert has spoken, so we don't have to really talk anymore or answer any of these questions that he's posed. So I haven't had a lot of luck, but I make up for that in several ways that I'll show you throughout this presentation. Obviously, being prompt and giving timely responses to your students, and kind of interacting with them on a regular basis, writing notes, obviously, developing your own responses and replies. I like to use private replies a lot because that encourages students to keep thinking, and it also encourages them to interact with one another in some different ways. And finally, the idea of synchronous sessions is also a possibility for you. Luckily, I've had at least one course where I've had 4 or 5 classes that have been synchronous. Students tend to like this, and they tend to write back and say this was a high point of the course because there is that interrelationship between us and also among them. So I try to create a lot of activities in our synchronous sessions so that they learn a lot by application. And I have them, also interacting in conferences. So my leadership course is based largely synchronously. My writing course is based on periodic conferences that I have with my students, and that's another way you can encourage interaction. I think overall you want to keep these 6 P's in mind. I thought of these myself this morning. Pretty good, huh? The idea being prompt, the idea being personal. So you really want to be authentic and give a sense of who you are. The idea being passionate. You're looking at the content and you're not just teaching it and going through the motions. This is something that's going to change your students' lives, and you want to recognize that from moment to moment as you're teaching. You want to be predictable, and develop your courses so that every week looks the same and that you're going through basically the same kinds of challenges and the same kinds of lessons and applications from week to week. You want to be practical. You want to keep everything at the level of application, particularly in discussion boards and wikis, as we'll talk about in just a moment. You want your students to learn by applying what they're learning to the real world and seeing how it's work. And that's one of the benefits of online courses, is shaping courses in that way. And you also want to be positive. So you always want to keep in mind that you're providing a positive message. So one of the ways in which I do this is I really focus on introductions, weekly introductions, obviously introductions to the course. So here's an introduction that I wrote for my 540 course that the course has to do with writing. And you'll see, if you kind of look at this, take a couple of minutes and read through it, couple of minutes, couple of seconds, and read through it, you'll see that there's a kind of a personal approach. And I try to give some background as to why writing is important to me and why writing might be important to students. So again, I try to be as positive as possible, and I try to convey a sense of how the course is going to work and why this is going to be fun, because it's going to be fun for me. And I try to establish a community of learners that's not just based on everybody looking to me, but all of us looking to one another. So, for example, I use the pronoun we a lot when I write announcements and introductions. We're all in this together. You're going to have to do this as students, but we're going to be learning from one another. Here's an example of an announcement, and this is one of the ways in which I get around sort of my having to intervene in discussion boards too much. What I'll do periodically is summarize discussion boards, particularly reflections that I ask for at the end of the lesson, at the end of the module, because their students are sort of free to kind of think a little bit more openly about, and they're asked more open-ended kinds of questions. But again, the idea is application from the get-go. And I try to go down and I try to go through those discussion boards and just highlight those different areas where students have been particularly mindful and particularly thoughtful. So this is an announcement that I wrote based on what what students had written, and sort of kind of connecting how all that content works. So again, there's that cognitive presence, there's that social presence, and there's the teacher presence that says, good job. And again, I try to end on a note of encouragement to kind of keep people going with the courses. And here's an example of another announcement. Usually what I do with announcements, and I'm sure all of you do the same sort of thing, is I try to summarize what's been going on during the week, how people have been learning, what I think about the work, and how we're progressing in the course, and then give students some preview and some idea and anticipation of what's going to be coming up in that particular week. So that's why I've included this particular announcement for you to take a look at. I also want to focus on feedback, because feedback is something that maybe some of you really focus on. I like to focus on it in my classes because, again, it's that exchange of social presence, cognitive presence, and teacher presence, trying to get students thinking. So we're going to talk a little bit about feedback for the next couple of slides. In particular, this is feedback to discussion boards. It's feedback to any grading that you do, any videos or any papers that you require of your students. So we won't be talking about timing, audience, motive feedback, clarity, specificity of tone, because those things you can make easy adjustments to. We are, on the other hand, going to talk about the amount of feedback, feedback focus, comparisons, function, and valence. So you want to look for teachable moments. You want to look for moments in student writing and student reaction and responses that really connect to the content in each interesting and thoughtful ways. And you want to emphasize relationships. You want to talk about how different people in discussion boards have operated with one another, how they've responded to one another, and their relationship to the content. So be careful about the amount of feedback. 2 or 3 points is usually enough. I like to have maybe a couple of positive ideas and then something that looks to try and improve the particular performance of the student. Also, feedback focus. You're looking at strengths. You're always emphasizing strengths in students, what they can do well and what you're seeing them do well. In every human situation, as we know for appreciative inquiry, something works. So we're always looking for what's working and what students do. And again, there's that positive idea that we want to stay positive in terms of what we're thinking about how students are working. Make different kinds of recommendations, comments, and encourage the students to have a sense of agency in the course and sort of being able to take the content and work with it successfully. You also want to encourage comparisons, again, comparisons to one another, as well as comparisons to grading systems, rubrics, and different standards and objectives that you've developed for weeks so that students can see how they can compare and how they're progressing. Feedback function is very important also, as well as valence. You want to be more positive than negative. Barbara Fredrickson at North Carolina University tells us that an 11-to-4 ratio, positive to negative comments, is usually what works the best in order to get people thinking and thinking wider, thinking bigger, and being open to the content and open to the ideas of the course. So you do want to be positive and always speak in constructive terms. I talk a little bit here about social presence because that also is something that you form as an instructor, as part of your teaching presence, how you go about relating to students. So just as you had a very personalized approach and talk about your experiences and your stake in a course, you want to have students do that sort of thing as well. You want to do video feedback for you and for your students. Talk about personalities, include photos and personal profiles. And again, positive, encouraging messages that are timely and prompt. Be responsive. So be, as soon as somebody writes you, as soon as somebody says something with which they need help, you want to get back in touch with them. That's particularly important in an online course because there can be that drift if you wait too long. You want to ensure that all your media is top shelf, and you want to make sure that periodically you have students evaluate their learning. Again, I like to have reflections every week. And certainly mid-semester, you're going to ask students for how they can improve things. So one of the ways, too, that I encourage social interaction and social presence in my courses, and this is something, again, that I shape out of my work as an instructor, is I encourage interaction. I always have wikis. The wikis are based on affinity groups. In this case, they're based on affinity groups by grade level. But you can combine groups by virtue of interest or by virtue of some of their passions or some of the things that you discovered or know about those students so that they can kind of work together in similar fashion with one another, at least have some sort of common understanding as they're going forward in these wiki groups. But I've done this for all my courses and it's been highly successful. Here's an example of responses to a poetry lesson that a student created in a wiki and how people responded. I don't grade wikis. I comment to wikis. In my announcements, I'll write about how the wikis are going. I might include a comment in a response to a reflection or a post about, oh, and your wiki really worked well, and some of your comments are very thoughtful. But I let students govern their own wikis, and some are successful, some aren't. Remember, there are different classes, right? And every class is different. How their interactions work are different from course to course and from year to year. So you have to accept the fact that you want to try these things, but they're not all going to work in the same way. Finally, the idea of cognitive presence. I really like to sit in that deliberation applicability square in this particular diagram. Everything is applied, and from there we see how theory works, what the conceptions are like, and we want to encourage more and more practice and action to take place. So you're going to remember these 6 Ps: prompt, personal, passionate, predictable, practical, and positive as ways of establishing teacher presence. And finally, in these references that I provide for you, last couple are 2 great books, and the last one I really want to point to, or I'm sorry, the next to last one, the Boettcher and Conrad book, Online Teaching Survival Guide. Absolutely great piece of writing, well done, and can give you all sorts of good ideas about how to establish an interactive, engaging, and successful online course. So with that, I'm going to leave you. Hopefully you've learned something. Hopefully I've given you some ideas. I certainly appreciate your tuning in. Good luck with your online courses and really enjoy them. They can be great proving grounds for good thinking and good work across the board, yours as well as your students. So thanks very much, and I look forward to seeing you on campus.